In the last video, we talked about divergent and convergent thinking, and we discussed how divergent thinking refers to ideation that calls for lots and lots of equally viable solutions or ideas or responses to a question, for example. And we also, conversely, talked about convergent thinking as ideation that calls for one correct response. Right? So we have divergent thinking and we have convergent thinking. Now, when we're talking about diverging effectively, what are some ways that we do that? How do we do that? How do we come up with lots and lots of ideas? How do we generate lots and lots of ideas in an effective way? Well, luckily this has been something that was ironed out for us, and it was done so about over half a century ago. It was ironed out by a gentleman named Alex Osborne in the 1940s, and Alex Osborne was the CEO of a rather large advertising company in the United States, and he developed brainstorming as the process of problem solving, right? And he conceptualized, or he thought of brainstorming as a series of back and forth between diverging and converging. Okay, and he, based on his experiences and based on his observations, he came up with 4 guidelines for brainstorming, right? So these are known as Osborne's guidelines for brainstorming, and they really are effective, and they help in guiding best practices for doing solid brainstorming and solid divergent thinking. So these are the 4 practices. The first guideline is to strive for quantity. And generally, what striving for quantity means is you want to come up with lots and lots of ideas. Generally, the first ideas that we come up with aren't the most interesting, they aren't the most innovative, they aren't the most original or unusual ideas. They aren't really the coolest or best ideas, right? So what we want to do is we want to strive to come up with many, many ideas. And generally, what I recommend is usually to aim for at least 20 ideas. So every time we brainstorm, you want to come up with at least 20 ideas, and really, once you build up your ideational capacities and you build your divergent thinking musculature, really you want to aim for more. Really you want to strive to come up with 30 ideas or 25 or 30, something like that, right? So you want to build that up and come up with lots and lots of ideas every time you brainstorm. So the first guideline is to strive for quantity. The second guideline is to defer judgment. So quite often, what happens when we're coming up with ideas, especially when we're doing this in groups, but also independently, is we start to analyze our ideas, right? We start to have discussions about, oh, well, what do you mean by that idea? Is that a good idea? Is that realistic? Is that original? Is that even like something that we should accept? And that is something that is detrimental to divergent thinking. That is something that is detrimental to the brainstorming process and really to creativity in general. So what we want to do is we want to take our analysis, take our critical thinking, and we want to backburner it. We want to defer it. We want to push it off until later, right? For the time being, what we want to do is we want to welcome all the ideas into the room. We want to nod them in. We want to affirm them, right? And then we just want to re-ask the question and keep coming up with ideas. So deferring judgment is the second guideline for brainstorming, probably the most important one. In fact, I'll go on a limb and say that it is the most important one. So, first guideline, strive for quantity, try to come up with lots of ideas. Second one, defer judgment. Okay? The third guideline is to freewheel. Now, the first 2 of these guidelines really are best practices. And the third and fourth are really to be thought of as strategies for when you hit a wall. Right? They're strategies for when you get stuck, when the ideation starts to wane, when the pace starts to wane, and you feel like you don't really have any more ideas. So here are those 2 strategies that Osborne came up with to re-stimulate your divergent thinking process, your ideation flow, if you will. So the third guideline is to freewheel. What does freewheeling mean? Freewheeling means like popping a wheelie on a bike, right? It means letting loose the wildest ideas that you think of. So I'll often ask, okay, we thought of all kinds of ideas of some great world leaders, for example. Now, why don't we go wild and say some extreme ones, some of those ones that you were holding back, maybe some more controversial. So go wild. You want to go wild with your ideas here. You want to freewheel. Okay, so that's the third guideline. That's something that's a good strategy for when you hit a wall, when the ideas start to wane. And the fourth guideline, another good strategy, is to build off other ideas. So, quite often, something that we don't like to do in our everyday life is we don't want to copy anybody's ideas. And we don't really want to do that here too. But when you hit a wall, it's not a bad practice to look at other ideas that we already came up with and try to build off them, right? How could we build off that idea to make it way extreme, right? How could we build off it in a way that might be unexpected? How could we combine a couple of ideas that are already up on the board, right? So that's the fourth guideline. That's the fourth strategy there. So we strive for quantity. You try to come up with as many ideas as possible. Then you defer judgment. You can see I circled it here in red, because that's really the key to effective divergent thinking, to effective brainstorming. And then when you hit a wall, when the ideas start to wane, when the flow starts to wane, to slow, you could freewheel. The third guideline. Come up with some wild ideas, things that you maybe thought not to share. And then the fourth one, look at other ideas that are already up on the wall, and then try to build off them in some unique and unusual way. So those are the 4 guidelines for brainstorming, and they really are strategies for effective brainstorming.